need a new approach, and that approach needs to contain fighting for the right to strike. It wasn't legal in 1970, and they pulled that off, and they were successful, but it needs to have a majority. Are we at that point now? I'm not sure.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We have on the line now Tyler Vassar. Tyler Vassar is the he is a letter carrier with the National Association of Letter Carriers and chair of the coordinating committee of Build a Fighting NALC. Really excited to have him on. Going to be talking to him about several of the things involved in this tentative agreement. So Tyler, thank you for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. It's been a while. We tried to get on around the convention. It didn't really work out, so I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely, yeah. We were able to get Corey on around the convention. Wasn't able to coordinate our schedule, so glad we've been able to get you on now. Before we get into the TA, can you talk a little bit about, biographically, your time in the union? How long have you been a member of the NALC, and what made you want to get involved so heavily in the union?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've been a letter carrier and a member of NALC for 6 years, since 2018. I've been a steward with NALC for about 4 years. To talk about what made me want to get involved in NALC, I think it'll be important to get into my background. I grew up in a union house. My dad and my grandpa were both 49ers, members of the Operating Engineers Local 49. They mostly do construction work, highways, roads, bridges, that sort of thing. My dad works on a plant on the Minnesota River, unloads barges. My grandpa was a street sweeper and snow plower. My mom's a preschool teacher. So my parents, from a young age, taught me that the union was essential to the livelihood that they were able to provide for me and my two older brothers. Growing up, my dad would say some version of these two things. The world needs ditch diggers, and I might be a ditch digger, but I'm a ditch digger with a union. You see this house, you see these cars, this livelihood. We were by no means rich, but we weren't dirt poor. And he would say that's because of the union. So that's the values that I grew up with, and they stuck with me. They've stuck with me my entire life. When I was 18 or 19, I got politicized by Bernie Sanders' first run for president. I joined a group called Socialist Alternative. I got involved with the $15 minimum wage campaign in Minneapolis. We helped make Minneapolis the first city in the Midwest to pass a $15 minimum wage back in 2017. That doesn't sound like a lot now, but that was a big deal back then. Mm-hmm. Worked on a city council campaign after that. And I think the point I'm trying to get to is that's where I got the basics of organizing, and built off of the values I grew up with. But it was after that I realized I needed to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. Do I continue with school and become a teacher? That's a path I would have taken. It would have been a noble path, but or do something different. It was one of those moments in your early 20s where you're really questioning everything. What's the right path? That's when a friend suggested I get a job as a letter carrier. The job itself looked attractive to me. Get to wear a cool uniform. It's an active job. That was really important to me. And most importantly, I had a union, and I knew I wanted to get involved in a union, fight to make life better for myself and for the people around me.
That's fantastic. And I'm always a little bit jealous when, I talk to people who grew up in union households and like being able to kind of grow up with the knowledge of the importance of, organized labor and the ability to kind of fight for yourself and not have to take what the boss says for granted. And so that's, really exciting to hear that you had that kind of growing up and that, that education to know to fight and fighting is important. And that's how working people are, how we've been able to get, the small things that we have gotten, we had to fight for them. And so, you talked about your kind of decision to the things that politicized you, and I was actually politicized in exactly the same time period in 2015 from Bernie Sanders' presidential run. And some people call it like their radicalization, and it's interesting, and I wonder if that's a purposeful choice that you made to call it your politicization, because that's what I've taken to calling it too, because I don't actually perceive much of my politics as being like radical in a kind of like out of this world sense. I conceive of my politics as very normal. Like, I think that people should have some amount of say in the place where they spend the majority of their waking lives. I don't believe in the, divine right of kings. I don't believe in the divine right of bosses, right? And I think that it's illegitimate that, the owning class has so much power over us. And I think that we should have more power. And I don't know. I don't conceive of that of that as radical. And so I do not tend to describe my political journey as having been radicalized. I conceive of it as having been politicized. And so from that politicization, you mentioned that, you wanted to join a union a union job, get a union job. And so I'm interested in the steps that happened between getting a union job and being a steward and seeing a need that you felt like wasn't being answered by your local leadership and the need to start Build a Fighting NALC. I think that my understanding is that you were the founder of this reform caucus. And so walk us through those steps.
Yeah. So, I'm a big fan of history. It was always my favorite subject in school. I've read a lot of history of the labor movement. And throughout the labor movement's history, there have been various rank and file caucuses, reform caucuses, movements within unions to challenge the status quo and the complacency that can set in to any organization, to even the most radical unions. And just on that word radical, I think it's only described as radical because we are challenging the status quo, even as reasonable as our ideas are to us and the majority of people we interact with. But
Right.
there's always been these sorts of movements that have grown up within unions, even the strongest of unions in our country. But as a new carrier working forced overtime, sometimes 60 hours a week, being thrown from route to route, from station to station, making substandard pay, and really feeling like a second-class carrier, I knew there was a lot to organize around in our own union. I knew that a reform movement or caucus was ultimately needed. But you can't just come out and proclaim yourself a reform caucus or get one or two people and say, boom, we're a thing, and expect people to join and build it. This all really started to develop with the fight for the open bargaining and contract campaign resolution last year, which I'll get into in a second. But from the beginning, it's always been more than just me. And while there's always reform-minded and even radical NELC members across the country, we were not organized as a real national force. That's something we're trying to build with BFN. But the basis for BFN, as we know it today, really started in Branch 9 in Minneapolis. For years, there's been a really good group of carriers, of NELC members who have been meeting as a sort of rank and file group outside of union meetings to talk about what we can do locally to help get newer members involved. Because just showing up to a union meeting can be quite intimidating at first. And so this has been a really good place for us to come together, bring new people in and discuss what we can do to change the union. Many of the key people of that group and I are currently running on the Branch 9 reform slate for leadership of Branch 9. Voting just started. We'll find out the results in a few weeks. I'm feeling pretty good about it. That group has overcome the opposition of the current leadership on different motions and resolutions and initiatives over the past few years. Most importantly, we organized a contract rally back in April of 2023 in Minneapolis, just a few months after this current round of negotiations began. That's how long it's been that these negotiations have gone on for. We argued the whole time that we needed a real contract campaign. We needed leverage in negotiations. We needed to fight. We needed it to be national. The point I'm trying to get to is that through this whole process, we developed a key group of people locally, then set our sights on the 2024 National Convention, which happened just this past August in Boston. Again, I want to thank you for the coverage on that. That was really great. I think you got a lot of letter carrier viewers probably from that coverage of the convention. So that's fantastic. We passed the open bargaining and contract campaign resolution in Minneapolis in Branch 9 late last year. It was calling for more transparency in negotiations, for updates, for a nationally coordinated contract campaign with rallies and ways to build public pressure and leverage to fight for more in negotiations. I know it's a radical idea, but it is because it was not at all. It's so opposite from the approach NELC currently takes. And so we started organizing Zoom meetings to spread the movement because it only takes one branch passing a resolution for it to be heard at the convention. But we asked the question, Why not get as many branches as possible to pass it? That way we could start the discussion and debate early, and the convention would not be the first time a majority had heard about it. We held a series of roughly once a month Zoom meetings over the course of the last year to build momentum for the resolution. We ended up getting something like 40 branches to pass some form of the resolution. It was the first time something like that has happened in NELC in a long time, if ever. We ended up winning a slightly watered down version of the resolution at the convention. But just as important is that throughout this process, it became clear that we needed more than just open bargaining and contract campaign resolution to transform NELC. We needed an ongoing organized effort, a movement, and ultimately a rank and file reform caucus. The first, just the last two things here, just to get to the end here. The first Zoom meeting we organized was called Build a Fighting NELC, Fight for Open Bargaining. It had just over 100 people on there. My brother, Corey Walton, who's been on this show, he's a steward down in Branch 4 in Nashville. He's the host of the most widely listened to letter carrier podcast from Arbitration. He said on his episode following our first meeting, this new group called Build a Fighting NELC, and boom, that's our name. You don't always get to name yourself. But I think it's a pretty good name. And so BFN exists and is being organized because we need to put the fight back in our union. We need to relearn our history and rebuild the traditions of the past. Most NELC members are not currently active, but members are starting to get involved, starting to wake up. Sometimes it takes something catastrophic like a sellout contract for a broader layer to wake up. But BFN exists exactly and was built exactly for a moment like this. We think that this movement needs to be organized and needs a program, needs demands, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit later. But that's long story short, that's where BFN came from. That was my role in it. And there were many others who've played really crucial roles and key roles in helping develop it up to this point.
Yeah, and so coming to the present day, we do have the tentative agreement now, and it's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of NALC members are not active right now. I was surprised to learn when I was coordinating the call with President Renfro, the communications director said that y'all have a 93% density or something like that, which is really impressive, and it is honestly kind of surprising coming from a federal sector union where our density is not that. It is like not even 50% nationwide, which is very scary. We've been talking some about the election, and so the prospects of a second Trump administration for my union in particular is very worrying. But I'm interested in how you think it is that the NALC has been able to have such a high density, despite maybe at the very least your perception that it doesn't engender very much of a fight or kind of ownership of the union to its members. I'm interested in that if you feel like there's a disconnect there, and then some of your reactions to Renfro's interview on our program last week.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. Before the 1970 strike and before NELC even had the right to collectively bargain, the union still existed. But before collective bargaining, union density was also very high. And that was always something that commentators would be like, wow, they don't even have the right to collectively bargain. It's mostly like a lobbying effort. And there's some local things that stewards can do to, defend you on the workroom floor. But that was something that was always very surprising to commentators even back then, that pre-collective bargaining union density was really high. I don't remember the numbers. I think it was in the 90s as well. Today, that's a really good question. I think if you do this job, unless you get really lucky and you're at a good station that's fully staffed and you have the nicest managers in the world, you understand every single day. Even if you grumble, you can grumble about, rightfully so, about the state of the national union, about negotiations, about the overall approach of the union. You are reminded every single day why you are a member of that union. If you are at a station, if you've ever been at one station with a bully manager and a bully supervisor, and that's not every station, but it's more than it should be. Even one station with a bully as a manager is one too many. If you aren't even at one station like that, you understand, and you have a halfway decent steward that stands up for you and fights for you, you understand why you got to be a member of this union. And I think there's more to it, but I think that's one of the main reasons that the density is so high. It could be better. I want it to be 100%. I want it to be 99% at least, but it's a good starting point, especially compared to a lot of federal unions. In terms of my reaction to the interview with NELC President Brian Renfro from last week, a lot of what I heard in that interview were also things I heard at the Minneapolis rap session, which happened on Halloween. Like he mentioned there last week, there are 4 regional rap sessions held this week: Houston, San Francisco, Minneapolis, and today, currently in Washington, D.C. And so that's for branch leaderships to come and hear from Renfro about the contract. I was lucky that this one was in Minneapolis. I was able to put in a change of schedule to switch my days off in order to go with about 10 other members of Branch 9 here in Minneapolis. One of the things that really bothered me about what Renfro said in the interview, and especially at the rap sessions. In the interview, I think he was a little more tame. I don't know, that's not the right word exactly, but in the rap sessions, he went a little harder with this. But the idea of, I'm not here to tell you how to vote, I'm just going to give you information. Now, that's all good and fine, but if you say that, and then you proceed to go through the agreement, talk about how it's the best we could do, and then fearmonger over postal finances and the potential to lose everything in arbitration, then you are advocating a yes vote. You're just not being open and honest about it. It was then heavily implied that this is how branch leadership should relay the information to their members locally. It's dishonest, in my opinion, to do this. Leadership means taking a position and being able to defend it while making space for opposing points of view, right? At my station, where I'm the steward, we've had many conversations about the tentative agreement at the daily stand-up talks. I always preface my points by saying your vote is your vote. I can't force you how to vote, but as the steward, it is my duty and responsibility to tell you my opinion and to make the case for it. I support a no vote, and here is why. Not everyone at my station supports a no vote. There are a few that are planning to vote yes. I don't ostracize them. Those are my brothers and sisters. Those are my friends. Those are my buddies at the station. We work alongside each other every single day. I'm still going to defend them and do everything I can for them as a steward, even if they're voting yes or voting no. But I do try to talk to them about their reasoning, make the case to them for why I think we should vote no. We should build a vote no campaign. We can fight for more. To me, that's leadership. And that really was disappointing to see that pushed really hard at the rap sessions. And when I got up and spoke from the floor and said, no, I actually disagree. I think that you should take a position while opening space for an opposing point of view. Half the room sort of nodded their heads. The other half of the room, snickered and sneered and shook their heads and whispered under their breaths. That's fine. But this is that's an approach that I feel really strongly about. On the question of fear mongering about postal finances and arbitration, on the finances, there's without a doubt a lot of waste at the Postal Service, some fat that can be trimmed, no doubt. But the bigger question to me is, if the Postal Service is a public service, and we believe it provides an important service for the American people, why isn't it treated as such? If the Postal Service management cannot manage their own finances, they can't figure out how to run the Postal Service and provide for the workforce with the wages and the working conditions they demand and they need to survive, then we need to look at the funding model of USPS. If the Postal Service says they're losing all this money, well, then maybe it should be publicly funded. I think we could make that case because I believe the public postal service is in the public's interest. As package delivery becomes more important in the US economy and to daily life in this country, then it's in the public's interest to have a public option. Having a high quality, affordable option in USPS forces the private sector competitors to keep their prices relatively close to ours. They can't charge exorbitant rates because then no one would go with them. You would better believe if USPS didn't exist, UPS, FedEx, and Amazon would be charging a lot more for their services. And on the question of arbitration, just a few months ago, Renfro said that we were in a strong position to go to arbitration. So that begs the question, what's changed? I don't want to sow any illusions. I know we're going to talk about arbitration a little more in depth, but I don't want to sow any illusions in arbitration. But if we can win, if we win a strong no vote, 75%, 80%, we send it to arbitration and we put up a fight and we do public demonstrations, we can win more than the sellout contract that we currently have presented to us. Hiding behind fear-mongering over arbitration is just another way to try to stamp out carriers' hopes and expectations and to push for a yes vote. So there are more thoughts, but I know we're going to get into that more later.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I want to get into.
I want to hear your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely, and I don't have very many. Like you said, we're going to get into arbitration here soon, and you talked about making the case for a no vote and how you didn't really appreciate kind of Renfro's positioning of, we're not making an official recommendation. And that was surprising to me as well, that they weren't officially taking a position. Also, it is interesting to me that it sounds like at your rap session where they were talking about the contract, that the room was a little bit more split. We've had some comments on during this stream and during other videos that we've had. And it's an observation that I've made as well, that I don't think I have seen a single advocate for a yes vote other than Renfro within our comments. And the communications director actually called me and asked me how it went and what the reaction was. And so I told him, I was like, well, it wasn't great. I have to say, people were upset about it. And I was shocked at how many people said that they're going to be voting no, and how I didn't see a single... The closest thing that I saw to somebody advocating for voting yes, which it still wasn't that. This person, I think, was undecided. They said something about, I'm concerned about our chances in arbitration with the current negotiating team. And so I don't know how I'm going to vote, because I don't know if we can get better in arbitration based on, Renfro's positioning at this point. And so, that's not a great endorsement. And so I want to know why you think that room was more evenly divided, it sounds like, than we are seeing online. When I've been having these conversations and been saying that I'm holding a certain amount of skepticism about kind of the breadth of the vote no kind of contingent, because of what I saw last year at UPS with the Teamsters, where the things that I saw were overwhelmingly opposed to the tentative agreement. There were still, in that case, at least there were some who were advocating voting yes that I saw, that it was a minority, but it was still sizable. But the majority that I saw online was advocating a no vote, and very clearly that was not the way that most of the membership felt. It was passed by like 90%, right? So I'm holding some amount of skepticism here, but that kind of, I'm interested why you think that room is so different than what we've been seeing online. Is the online just so unrepresentative of the membership, or was that room really more representative of like a leadership cohort that is maybe to a certain extent disconnected from the rank and file, who are overwhelmingly going to be voting no on this TA? And then, speaking of making the case, what is the case for voting no? Why isn't this tentative agreement enough?
Yeah. So I think if that was a room full of 200 rank and filers, I think it would have been a much different situation. Instead, there was space for 250. About half the seats were empty. I bet just under half. There were probably about 150 people there. I personally talked to a number of branch presidents or people in different branches who said, yeah, we're not sending anyone because we're voting. We already saw the TA. We're not going to go spend branch money just to hear it from leadership itself and waste the membership's money. So we're just not even going to show up. So that was part of it. But ultimately, I think it was that amongst branch leaderships, I think there's a disproportionate amount of Renfro supporters or people that are willing to at least hear out the case than if you had a room full of rank and file members, which I made that case from the floor. I said, there's over 2,000 letter carriers in the Twin Cities metro area, in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Why was this done in the middle of the day? You could have gotten hundreds of letter carriers who would like to hear from their branch president about the TA if you had done this in the evening. But the point I want to get to is, yeah, I think it's just because it was a lot of branch leaderships that were there, that it was more disproportionate. Of course, there was those that were for a yes vote, those that were for a no vote, and some that were sort of sitting on the fence. And so even though I think we knew going in that the room was always going to be a little skewed away for a yes vote, we still got to go and make our case. Hear what Renfro has to say. He went into more detail than was just in the TA, but not much more detail. And try to make our points from the floor and get connected with people that want to vote no. And on that point about UPS and on all of that, yeah, of course, the internet is going to have a lot of people, you're going to hear from the people that are the most fired up probably. And I don't think anyone that is voting yes is very fired up. That being said, I think that the no votes, based on my being at the stations and talking to other stewards in Branch 9 across the country, the no vote, I think, is where the momentum is right now. But the point is, we have to get organized for a no vote. You can't just put it out there, yep, we're voting no. And then a month from now, when the ballots get sent out finally, expect a no vote to win. That's why, which I might get into more later on, BFN and others in the reform effort are organizing a vote no campaign, flyering stations. We had our first day of action on Wednesday, where over 40 stations got together and either flyered or did parking lot meetings and rallies, took group photos. If you go to Build a Fighting NALC's Facebook page or go to the From ADA Arbitration subreddit, you'll see tons of photos of entire stations or big chunks of stations going out before the shift, taking group photos with vote no signs. That's the kind of thing you need to do to build momentum. You can't just rely on momentum alone, because if we do that, then it's more likely people will just kind of go, I don't think we can win anything better. I'm alone on this. I'll just vote yes just to get the back pay. But we got to organize a no vote. I'm not sure there was a bit of organizing for a no vote with UPS, but it wasn't on the level that we're already at with within NELC with BFN, and we've only just begun. So in terms of like, what do I think about the TA? Why isn't it good enough? There's a couple different things I want to just, if you bear with me. The pay is inadequate. Diet colas still exist. I'll explain that in a second. The non-career workforce is maintained. Mandatory overtime still exists, and overtime rule changes are a give back. NELC was founded on an 8-hour day, and we're doing things to really undermine that, which I want to go through each of those. It's important not just to point out what is wrong, but to put forward ideas and a program of what we should be fighting for. On the terms of pay, there were minor gains for the bottom and the top, but it's, in my opinion, too little too late. 1.3% annual increases are a slap in the face to letter carriers everywhere. BFN is fighting for a $30 an hour starting wage and top pay on par with UPS. 20 years ago, new employees started out around $20 an hour. Adjusted for inflation, that would be around $30 an hour today. We've gone backwards in terms of wages for carriers in that time. I'm glad we were able to chop off 2 steps at the bottom of the pay scale. That's better than nothing, but at a minimum, every other carrier should have been bumped up 2 steps as well. That easily could have been done. BFN ultimately is fighting for cutting the pay scale in half from 13 years down to 6, which is an official position of NELC in terms of the COLAs, the cost of living adjustments. Our COLAs were major gains from the struggles of the 1970s and workers dealing with their own inflationary times then. But our COLAs, as they currently stand, are not enough. First of all, they're not one-to-one with inflation. If inflation's 5%, we don't get 5% COLAs. They're based off of a formula which comes out to about half of inflation. And based on that formula, top pay gets that full amount, about half of inflation, and then those further down the pay scale get a fraction of that amount. We call that diet COLA. BFN thinks that we should have, at the very least, get 100% COLAs based on our formula for all steps, and ultimately, we should be fighting for our COLAs to be one-to-one with inflation. If inflation's 5%, it should be a 5% raise. That's the only way, to me, you could possibly sell 1.3% annual raises as a win. Because as it stands currently, if our general wage increase, 1.3%, and the COLA doesn't come out to higher than inflation, that's a pay cut, period. A few months ago, Renfros said that any TA offer that had a non-career workforce would be a non-starter. This TA maintains CCAs, the non-career workforce. The creation of CCAs, along with the 2-tier pay scale, was one of the worst things that happened to the letter carrier craft. It created a second-class tier of letter carrier, lower pay, more exploited, forced to work up to 60 hours a week or more. It creates division among carriers. And for these reasons, BFN is calling for an all-career workforce. But an all-career workforce alone is not good enough. BFN's also fighting for an end to mandatory overtime. Rural carriers already have this. This isn't something we're making up out of nowhere. Rural carriers already have this rule. We should have the right to refuse overtime outside of our own routes. So, there's a lot more to be said, but I'll highlight one more thing. The TA has givebacks on our 1260 rules that carriers are not allowed to work over 12 hours in a day or 60 hours in a week. NELC was founded in the late 19th century. It was veterans of the Union Army who were letter carriers founded the NELC. And one of the main goals at that time in the broader labor movement and for the founding of NELC was the fight for the 8-hour day. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for recreation. No one should want to or have to work past 12 hours, much less 8 hours. The only reason that would be possible is because the wages are too low. On top of that, this gives management the incentive to never have to properly staff stations. They can just rely on a few carriers at each station to work 12, 13, 14, 15 hours or more. And that could ultimately end up with cuts to routes. And what do you do if then those super overtime carriers are sick or on vacation or something? Then guess what? Everyone at the station is getting forced. So that's ultimately a give back that I don't think is acceptable. And those are some of the main reasons that I and BFN oppose this TA.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And so we said we were going to be talking about arbitration. Let's talk about arbitration. The primary argument, it seemed to me, from Renfro against voting down the contract is that you can't get, you're not going to be able to get more in arbitration. What do you make of that assessment? Put more conservatively, and then some of the things that I hear is that you're saying that he's waving around as kind of like a bear bug, like scary thing that you could lose everything in arbitration, which seems kind of that seems kind of difficult to believe that would happen in arbitration, but. What do you make of the idea that you're not going to get more in arbitration? And then, from the perspective of somebody that's not happy with this agreement, like that commenter that I mentioned earlier that said, well, if that's the, if that's the case that the union is making, the union says we're not going to get better in arbitration. Well, the union is supposed to be the side that's arguing for more in arbitration. So, like, is there precedence of an arbitrator going above and beyond like what a union is asking for? Like when he said that, I actually I've never been through arbitration, so maybe you can help me out. But like, I almost worried about him saying that on my program publicly because I wouldn't be surprised if like the Postal Service is looking through his public statements and is saying and like clips that and puts that in their argument and says, look, he doesn't even think that they can. And so that would be part of the Postal Service's argument in arbitration. And so what do you make of that argument that you can't get better in arbitration and so you should vote yes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's just a fear-mongering tactic, like I laid out before. But I would just really ask, like I asked before as well, what happened to us being in a strong position to bring it to arbitration, which was put forward several times over the last 6 months. I don't want to sow any illusions into arbitration. It's not just vote no and hope for the best. It's vote no and organize a real contract campaign. That means public rallies and demonstrations. That means nationally coordinated actions. That means to tell the public, the arbitrator, and USPS and our own negotiators why we voted no and what we demand, what we need. That would involve a media campaign. It would involve getting the members organized. It would involve these parking lot rallies and meetings and group photos on a scale of what we've seen already times 10. That's what a real contract campaign would look like. Ultimately as well, like something I've been talking to people about is if we show USPS that they can starve us out for 500 days every single time and we will accept a substandard contract, a sellout contract, we accept the crumbs that they're willing to give us after nearly 2 years of negotiations, because negotiations started in February of 2023. They'll try to do that every time. And so on that principle alone, but that combined with everything else, we have to vote this down and we have to fight for more. And then someone else made a good point to me the other day that it would be in President Renfro's best interest if this is voted down, especially in overwhelming numbers. It would be in his own political interests to negotiate and fight for as much as possible. Of course, he could go and not do anything and then arbitration comes back and it's bad and say, look, I told you so. But I also think the case could be made that he would understand, and I hope he would understand that if it gets sent to arbitration on the back of a strong no vote, and they put up a substandard approach, then then there'll be political retribution for that in 2026 in terms of concerned letter carriers or Mike Cariff or one of the other reform slates that are running to take over leadership. So yeah, again, I don't want to sow any illusions in arbitration. I'm not saying we vote no and we hope for the best and place all our faith in the lawyers and whoever else. We pay, I'm sure, lots of money to do this stuff for us. But we vote no, and we build a real movement to force them to at least listen to us and fight for more. And the contract, it can't get much worse. It really cannot. I think we can vote no and we can fight for a lot more.
One of the things that I've been seeing, and I'm just interested in if you've been seeing this as well, but in some of our comments and in actually one of the voicemails that we got last week, there was somebody talking about, I don't know, and I'm not even really clear about it, but there's some concern about like the actual counting of the ballots for this ratification vote. Some people have like distrust in the person who is going to be counting the ballots and responsible for the execution of the election of the referendum on ratification. Is there any is that real, or is that people kind of like bringing some of their political stuff into something where it's not really like, is there an actual concern there that BFN is tracking?
So, it's not nothing, but I think there's a 15-member ballot commission or whatever it's called. Okay. One member from 15 different states it is appointed, but that have oversight over the process. I know there are ways to ensure the process is done how it's supposed to be done. And then CLC, the concerned letter carriers, which Corey Walton is connected with, and James Henry is the current vice president who's running on that slate. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that they and others will be there to ensure it's a fair process. But it's not, I don't want to discount completely, but I think that there is a real process to make sure that, and there's checks and balances to make sure that it's actually a fair process. I would, ultimately, I think that it's more so just like the broader craziness of the politics and the presidential elections are sort of finding their manifestations into our own elections. But there are, I don't want to discount it completely. There are processes and there are forces and groups that will be looking into that to make sure it's fairly done.
And really quick, before we get to these final questions, as a kind of internal political matter, you mentioned that there are multiple kind of reform slates or people that are going to be challenging Renfro for the presidency in 2026. Mike Cariff, concerned letter carriers. I don't think BFN is running anybody for president. And I think that you've said that you're explicitly planning not to run anybody for president. What is the strategy there? Why, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why is BFN not running anybody for president? Or are y'all going to be joining officially one of these other slates? Or like, what are your kind of thoughts about 2026?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Ultimately, BFN is still developing as a force. I think it's very good that there are forces like CLC, like Cariff, and potentially others who can take this sort of space up of like forming a slate or trying to run for the top positions. And, there will probably come a time when BFN endorses one or the other and campaigns for them with caveats. Of course, we'd have our own position, maybe disagree on some things, but agree with the overall approach. But that would be a decision that I don't get to make, or even just the coordinating committee. But BFN as a whole, we're in the process of just starting out. We've had in the last few days hundreds of people, I think over 200 at this point, who've signed up saying, I want to join BFN and start a chapter in my area. Now we're very new. Our coordinating committee is 8 people. We're expanding that and adding a few more people to that. But we're in the process of figuring out a process to reach out to people and help them develop chapters. What does it mean to start a BFN chapter? Right now, that means fighting for the Vote No campaign. But because of all these things, we're not in a position to run anyone for national elections. Doesn't mean we're going to abstain, but we do have a role to play, I think, as an independent rank and file reform movement, an eventual caucus in NALC in this process as a whole. For now, it's very, very good that all the forces in the broader reform effort are united behind a no vote. We can work together on a no vote while having differences of opinions on program or demands or these other things. We can have separate material, but still work together and fight for the strongest possible no vote. And so we are at the moment working with CARIF, with the CLC, with unaffiliated carriers and NELC members in the Vote No campaign. And I think out of that, we'll get a better idea of things. And within BFN itself, on the coordinating committee itself, as well as broader sort of supporters and the broader membership, there's a lot of confusion. There's people that support CLC more, support CARIF more, support both. There's a lot of people that want a unity ticket. Let's not split the reform vote. I think BFN can play a role in helping sort of, I don't know, call for unity as we get a little closer. We got 2 years. We're not in any hurry to make an endorsement, but we're not going to abstain as well, if that makes sense.
I agree with that for sure. There should be, since there are so many forces kind of coalescing around a need for reform, I definitely think the need for unity is an important one. Because it's a one member, one vote election, right?
That's right. Yeah, that was a reform that was won out of the 1970 strike. They were able to win one member, one vote.
Hell yeah, that's awesome. Are there any, what happens if nobody gets a majority? Is there a runoff, or does the plurality win? Or do you know? I don't know.
I'm not sure. As long as I've been a member, there's only ever been 2 candidates for each position running. So
yeah, well, that's definitely something, particularly if the plurality wins, like it's incredibly important that there's a sense of unity there, and so looking forward to kind of continuing to follow that. But like you said, 2 years, so not in any rush to kind of force any decision at this point. So you mentioned that the voting no, like BFN's position is that you can't vote no and then sit back and like wait for arbitration, right? You got to vote no, and there has to be you have to pressure the arbitrator. You mentioned that, and so is that what BFN is going to be doing in the event that it's voted down? The attention of your caucus is going to be turned towards building a pressure campaign around, like, talk us through that. What happens if it's not ratified? The contract is voted down for BFN.
So when we vote this thing down, I would hope that the national leadership would take that as a sign to get the members into the streets and to use that to fight for more, take up our approach, the demands we put on them for a public contract campaign and pressure strategy. But if they refuse to do that, then BFN, alongside the other forces in the reform movement, CLC, CARIF, and others, will be calling for national rallies, will be calling for an escalation of our Vote No campaign past just the election. Vote No, the Vote No campaign, like I said, has already started to some degree. We had a public meeting last Sunday, whenever that was, that had over 700 attendees. And we launched our first National Day of Action last Wednesday with flyering, parking lot meetings and rallies, group photos with Vote No signs in over 40 locations. Photos are still coming in. And with plans to do this at least one more time when ballots drop in late November or early December. Different branches are holding rallies on Veterans Day or other days. That's, ultimately, it would be good if it was nationally coordinated by the national leadership. But if they don't take this up, then we will, vote this down and hopefully the strongest numbers possible, and then build real pressure through public rallies and demonstrations and going to the media and that sort of approach.
One of the kind of signature asks or signature kind of planks of the BFN campaign is, or BFN's movement and kind of the your program is fighting for the right to strike. Is strike action possible in this moment? And how does BFN see fighting for the right to strike during this campaign, like, fighting for the right to strike as like one of the programs as one of the program points during this campaign and then going forward? Yeah.
No, when I went to Carrier Academy, the training in 2018, there was one point during one of the last days where NELC representatives come in and sign people up for the union. Before they even pull out the form and make the official appeal, they play you a 5-minute video. The video prominently highlights the 1970 Postal Wildcat strike. It talks about how the strike built the NELC. It turned the letter carrier job into the job that it was known to be for so long, one with good wages and working conditions. The reasons there were lines out the door anytime they were hiring for letter carrier positions, and you basically couldn't get a job there unless you had veteran preferred status. Those gains came from the 1970 strike and the avalanche of organizing and momentum that came out of it. The rank and file caucus that grew out of that strike and developed as a national reform caucus fought to transform the union. I saw that video. I said, I want to join that union, only to later find out it was illegal for us to strike. As long as we do not have the right to strike, we are fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. We have no real leverage, no pressure points against management when they play hardball in negotiations. As it currently stands, it's two people in the room negotiating one of the most important parts of the contract, the economic package, the NELC president and USPS's head negotiator. This contract, this sellout contract that we have as it stands right now with the TA, is what happens when we go with the current approach. We're even short of strike action. The union isn't even building public pressure through rallies, demonstrations, and informational pickets. We need a new approach, and that approach needs to contain fighting for the right to strike. And, is strike action possible at this moment? I think that's a really good question. I think it's a question of organization. Are we organized enough to pull it off? It wasn't legal in 1970, and they pulled that off, and they were successful, but it needs to have a majority or at least a significant portion of the membership to participate for it to be successful. Are we at that point now? I'm not sure. I know there's been lots of talk about it. I wouldn't explicitly encourage isolated actions or stickouts, but at the same time, if it can be organized enough, it can be successful. That being said, you got to be very careful. I'm advocating for the right to strike. I'm not advocating for people to go out tomorrow and go on strike. And just to explain how we would fight for the right to strike. Ultimately, I think this moment with strike action over the last few years, and in particular over the last year, from the stand-up strike to Boeing workers to longshoremen, workers in our own union have been wondering, you hear all the time, what kind of union are we if we can't strike? And then we get this TA, which we were told was going to be historic. And we get it, and it falls so far short of what workers were expecting and what we need in this inflationary moment, in this moment of crisis in the US and around the world, where workers need some stability. They want stability. They want to fight for more. And so in this moment, I think strike action is becoming more and more popular. And I would really encourage people, get behind this movement to fight for the right to strike. If you want to fight for the right to strike, join BFN and start a BFN chapter, and that's going to be a multiple pronged approach. At the 2026 convention, I'll just put this out there now, we still need to discuss this in BFN, but some ideas I have is we can put forward resolutions and fight for resolutions to make it so that our letter carrier political fund does not give money to anyone in Congress that does not support repealing the federal ban on striking. That we set up a strike fund, and that because we already have on the books that our union officially advocates for the right to strike. It was passed at the 1968, 1970, and 1972 conventions. But we need to build a real campaign around that. We need to organize with the other postal unions and other federal sector unions to build not just lobby Congress people in the individual rooms, but build a public pressure campaign to fight for this thing. It's only through that process that we could ever win the right to strike, both by getting it taken out of our contract and repealed at a federal level. And if they refuse that, but we get organized enough and actually pull something off. And so that's ultimately, I think, going to be one of the main demands and main things that BFN is built around in the years to come. And ultimately strike action is the ultimate tool, the ultimate weapon that workers have. And I think we have to fight for that right. And we have to fight for the ability to do that.
Coordinating among the postal unions is also very important, and I've seen some commentary from union members outside of the Postal Service and some from within, talking about why there are 4 postal unions. For people who don't know, there are 4. There are the rural carriers, the city carriers, the postal workers, and the postal mail handlers. Each of them have a separate union. So maybe part of BFN's program as you develop more and get further into the future will be amalgamation, but I won't put that in your mouth.
No, I'm firmly in support of that. At the very least, there should be one carrier union. Rural and city should be one union at the very least. I think ultimately, and at the very least, we should bargain together. We should bargain our contracts together. But ultimately, yeah, I agree. I think we need one big union at the post office in the long term.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go. Well, now he said it. Now it's not just me calling for amalgamation of the Postal Service unions. All right. Tyler Vassar, really appreciate your time. Where can people learn more about Build a Fighting NALC?
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. You can find us on Facebook under Build a Fighting NALC, or our website, which is just fightingnalc.com. Build a Fighting NALC domain was taken, so whoever took that, please, we would like that. But for now, we're fightingnalc.com. You can find materials for the Vote No campaign, articles, written stuff, flyers. Go there, go to a Facebook page, and as well on YouTube under Build a Fighting NALC. We're just getting started. So if anything you see, this is just the beginning. We're getting more organized. We're starting chapters across the country. You can sign up to join BFN on the website. We're developing a process for being able to reach out to people and talk people through, what does a chapter mean? What does it look like to join BFN? How do you organize and how do you fight for more? And how do we use this to transform NALC? We're not a separate thing. We're a group within our union. We're fighting to transform our union, rebuild the roots and traditions that we come from, and fight for a hell of a lot more than we currently have.
All right, there you go. Tyler Vassar, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.